So I want to take a moment before we go on to emphasize the importance of getting a representative sample in statistics. And specifically, we'll look at sample selection, sample size, and sampling methodology. And we'll do so using an example from the history of science. So in his unfortunately named The Mismeasure of Man, where he uses the gender-neutral use of man to talk about implicit discrimination, sadly, Stephen Jay Gould discusses the research of an anthropologist, Samuel George Morton. And what Gould suggests is that Morton is the scientist who's really interested in whether or not different groups of people have different innate genetic dispositions towards intelligence. And what Gould argues is that plausibly because of his unconscious bias, Morton engages in a number of highly questionable practices in what seems to be on the surface an earnest attempt to answer that question. So Gould suggests that Morton manipulates the composition of his samples. He reports his data selectively, he commits errors in data analysis, and he mismeasures his own skulls, all to better support his views on intelligence differences. So how does this occur? Well, let's look at manipulating the composition of his samples. So Morton is interested in whether or not Caucasians are more intelligent than other groups of people, races, quote unquote. And Morton decides what he'll do, since he's a craniologist, is measure the cranial capacity of the skulls of different groups of people. And so he chooses the skulls of white Caucasian males, right, relatively large individuals. And for the other races, he chooses smaller individuals. So for instance, here we see in this picture, this is an actual picture of his skull collection. Right? This is one of the skulls that's used in his studies. It's the skull of an individual from South America who was an Incan, who this group of people were just smaller in stature than the Caucasian males in his other sample. Now, it's not clear that he intended to do this, but surely he realized, right, that head size is proportional to body size. So even if cranial capacity was a good measure of intelligence, which it absolutely is not, right, he's already manipulated the composition of his samples in a way that biases them and taints any inferences that he could make from it. He reports that data selectively as well. He commits a number of errors in his data analysis too. And in fact, the entire presupposition of his experiment is a case of bad sampling methodology. He wants to get at intelligence, so he decides to measure cranial capacity. The idea being, the larger your cranial capacity, the more brain matter can fit in, the more intelligent you are. But there is no strong correlation in human beings and even between species with cranial capacity and intelligence. In fact, the biggest determinant of cranial capacity isn't your intelligence at all. Right? It's your body size. People's bodies are proportional. So their heads, if they were really large on small bodies, that would be an asymmetry that we don't see in human beings. It would make it hard for them to hold up their heads and so on. Right? And so even if cranial capacity was in fact a measure of intelligence, right, it turns out that what Morton would have or should have discovered is that large people, I don't know, like Shaq, for example, who have proportionately larger heads and hence larger cranial capacities, are, on his view, more intelligent than smaller people, like small children, or statistically speaking, women. So he exhibits these sampling methodologies that are bad. How does he measure cranial capacity then? Well, what he does is he takes those skulls and he pours in mustard seeds, fills up the skulls, and then pours it into a graduated cylinder to determine the volume. Now, what Gould alleges, and Gould's discussion is to some degree controversial, though it seems to have held up fairly well over time. What Gould suggests is that you can't reproduce Morton's numbers unless you engage in a different process in measuring the different skulls. So you got that big Caucasian guy skull, and you pour the mustard seeds in, you shift it all around, and you pack it in maybe with your finger a little bit, and then you pour it out. All right? And then you've got that Inca skull, and you fill it up, but you don't as vigorously stir it around or pack in the mustard seeds, and as a result, you introduce an error into your measurement of cranial capacity to compound the fact that it's not correlated with intelligence. So all of these things are examples of how, even if we don't intend to, we can get unrepresentative samples. In these cases are called experimenter bias. Right? The experimenter has a bias. That bias then taints what the experimenter is doing, not even necessarily consciously. We also have to worry about subject bias. So when you ask controversial questions, say in the early Kinsey studies on sexual orientation, right, where different sexual orientations were perceived to have a significant stigma in society, Kinsey had to take that into account, that subject bias, that hesitance to reveal their true sexual proclivities for fear of social reprisal. And so when we develop a good methodology, we try to make sure that we don't have experimenter bias or subject bias, polling bias, or poll subject bias. We don't mismeasure the results with our survey tools, and so on. And this is crucial, because if we don't do this, we can make inferences on the basis of bad data that isn't representative of the population, perfectly legitimate methodological inferences that are nevertheless not good inferences. So we'll pick things up again in the next module.